Hey, Richard Chapo here, your intrepid San Diego internet lawyer. Just wanted to cut a quick video today talking about an aspect of the new EU copyright directive that I don't think a lot of people are talking about, and it's something that should be raised, and that is the impact of the EU copyright directive and other rules and regulations in the EU on the EU startup environment. And at this point, I think that a very valid question that needs to be asked is, why would you ever try to start a business in Europe? The rules and regulations and the anti-business attitude that flourishes in the EU is just, it's creating the proverbial beast of burden. I think one of the problems that you have with all of these rules and regulations is that there's no taking into account that businesses need some help. That when businesses first start out, they are not all Facebook or Google, these evil empires that the EU likes to focus on. And so, if you don't provide some kind of a safe harbor where these companies can establish themselves and grow until they become, a stable functioning business, well, you're really doing your economy a disservice. Because remember, economies are just like human populations. You need new blood. Older companies are going to die out. Companies that aren't even old are going to fail. Who knows? But you need some innovation, to appear and to help keep your economy strong. And if you look at the EU right now, and you look at the top 20 internet companies in the world, not a single one is based in the EU. And the reason for that is nobody would be based in the EU if they had any right mind about them. The rules and the regulations and requirements they're just insane. And so we have kind of two approaches in the world. One is what we see in the EU, which I call the beast of burden. And the other one is a safe harbor approach, which we see in a number of other countries, including the US. And since the US is known, probably the best, let's focus on that. So the US will have a regulatory and a legal framework that's designed to create a safe harbor for businesses to get up and run before they have to worry about many of the legal requirements that more established businesses would face. And this is both on the federal and in the state level. It's just kind of an established attitude. So let's look at California. California recently passed the California Consumer Privacy Act, which is often considered, to be a GDPR light. It's very similar to the GDPR, though not as strict, and certainly written a little bit better in some areas than what we see with the GDPR. So with the GDPR, every business in Europe or that's doing business in Europe has to comply with it. There are no safe harbors. There's no exception for small businesses or anything. In the US or in California with the California Consumer Privacy Protection Act, a safe harbor exists. There's actually a 3-threshold system. The thresholds are just tests. And if you don't meet one of them, you don't have to comply with the law. And as you can imagine, the thresholds are designed to essentially categorize businesses between startups and those that are stable. And so the three thresholds are: one, do you have 25 million or more in revenues in a year? 2, do you make more than 50% of your revenues from the sale of personal data? 3, do you have more than 50,000 unique visitors to your property in a year? And those aren't, hugely large figures. I mean, 50,000 visitors to, let's say, a website in a year, that's nothing. That's 4,000 visitors a month. So we're not talking about, a space where companies can get away with, whatever it is they're doing. We're talking fairly low numbers here. But nonetheless, for startups, whether they're, funded by investors or we're just talking mom and pops, it creates a world where they don't have to worry excessively about, getting sued right and left or getting penalized by agencies, who are claiming they've breached some law or what have you. And it gives them time to focus on actually growing their business. What a concept. And then, as they grow, once they start reaching a certain level, then, at that point, you run into questions of, does liability start applying for different laws such as privacy and what have you? And the answer is yes. And so these companies then have to become more responsible and have to meet with, additional regulatory requirements. Now, the regulatory requirements are not anywhere near as bad as what we see in Europe, but they are, they're there. and obviously the US is a bit less regulated than the EU overall. But this is also true in other countries. You see the same thing in Canada, you see it in Asia in a number of places. And there's the idea that not all businesses are evil, which seems to be the overriding concept in Europe. And it's just, I mean, if you had, let's say you had $1 million in capitalization and you have a business idea, are you going to try to launch that business in the area where you're subject to heavy regulations and potential fines from 27 different supervisory authorities? Or are you going to try to launch that business in a country where, the regulatory burden is very low, particularly for a startup? You're going to have immunity from certain types of lawsuits. And really, you're not facing 27 different groups that can come after you and claim, violations of this regulation and that. And the answer should be pretty obvious. And in fact, that's what we see. I have a number of clients who've come from Europe and relocated to the US. And the sole reason for doing that, to get out from under the regulatory burden in the EU. That was their whole motivation for coming here. And I think when we look at the world now, you're going to see even more of this migratory pattern because we live in a world with, a digital world that makes mobility relatively easy. It's not that difficult. You can be in California and you can create a website and tailor to an audience in Japan or, whatever it is. You don't have to be in the location that you're actually providing the goods or services in. And so it opens up the ability for startups to move around. And I think if somebody was really smart out there, they would create an environment that is extremely friendly to entrepreneurs. So if we think about the offshore banking industry, we have all those mysterious islands off the coast of various countries where, shady banking was thought to be going. Well, the offshore banking industry is, taking a hit. It's not what it used to be. But I think if one of those islands was smart, they would launch a whole new campaign where they would pass laws that were very friendly to entrepreneurial launches, to startups, to individuals, to investors, and really try and create a market that was extremely favorable in comparison to someplace like the EU. And then they would start advertising in the EU. Hey, do you have a business idea? Do you want to launch it? Is it online? Come to whatever the island is. We have all these laws that are in your favor. You don't have to deal with all the bureaucrats in the EU, blah, 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 blah. And it would be interesting. I bet they would probably do pretty well because unfortunately, I just think the EU is going down the wrong road. Now, that isn't to say that the concepts that the EU is looking at aren't correct or don't have merit. I mean, certainly, shouldn't you have a right to know who's collecting your personal data and what they're doing with it? Absolutely. And even though I represent companies that collect that data, I agree with that concept. I mean, my data is being collected, but I think there are just better ways to do it. And there's certainly ways to do it without, crucifying your entrepreneurial market in your region. So it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. But nonetheless, keep a lookout for, those kinds of concerns because the EU is now in the process of launching even more regulations and directives that are going to be coming down the pipe. And at some point, you have to wonder, when it's going to start showing real damage to the economies in the EU, unfortunately. So anyways, that's it for today's video. Thank you for watching. Have yourself a good one.